A Light Within Darkness, Chapter 17, Fan Fiction by Azazyel. Waking up with someone within your arms was certainly nice, and, in my case, the lithe form of Elesmere lying partly atop my chest with her long blonde hair splayed out across her back before the nice blankets Elesmere acquired covered her hair was most certainly a welcome sight. You are finally awake. You slept for much longer than usual. Elesmere said nonchalantly as she moved within my grasp so her face wasn't buried into my chest, so she could pay attention to my sleeping patterns, and instead, so she could make eye contact. Yeah. The Genestealer battle took a lot out of me. And my dreams weighed even heavier upon me. I had a bit of a weird dream where Korn was trying to get me to join them, but in my waking mind, I realized it was merely a dream and not actually a piece of corn, as they wouldn't look like a big Amazonian woman with massive breasts and wear a loincloth to cover her privates and a spiked bookplate. God, I wish the Chaos Gods were actually seductive like that. But nope, it's 90% pure suffering with them. What dreams could cross your broad mind that can bring about such miracles? Elesmere asked in honest curiosity, as she was probably thinking I had some great new revolution that could upturn the galaxy if I had the resources to put it into effect, like my warp gates. Big titty corn, I said blandly, making the elf within my arms freeze as she blinked in surprise. Excuse me, but I think I may be the one dreaming. What did you say? For a moment, I considered just shutting up, but then I remembered the truth of chaos in this universe. The Chaos Gods mirrored the warp, and the warp mirrored the galaxy at large. So, if I became powerful enough to push my will into the fabric of the galaxy, I could change the very makeup of the Chaos Gods and the warp itself. I dreamt of turning Korn into an Amazonian woman a couple feet taller than me and defeating her in honorable combat to take her as a concubine. Elesmere didn't respond for a whole minute as her eyes stared before she nodded. In terms of ambition, I certainly cannot deny that such a target would be one of the highest, but should you desire to impose your will upon and change a demon, I highly suggest you work your way up the ladder, so to speak. That was fair enough, and I already had a technique that did such with the Shadow Demon's summoning ability that opened a small hole into the warp, but while I was here on a human planet, summoning a bunch of familiars could get me in trouble, to say the least. So, what do you plan to do now that we have a semi-stable home here in the lower hive where our lungs won't rot from the nasty, damp air? Elesmere asked finally. I hummed in thought before I shrugged, as honestly, my only goal was to get stronger right now. Well, those people who are getting your next core material to start your next technique won't be ready to meet with me for the next week. So, in the meanwhile, I am going to enrich a small area here in the warehouse for me to absorb far more warp energies. Elesmere nodded, and when asked about what she should be doing in the meanwhile, I simply told her to go over the mind-cleansing hymns or just go out to make some more money by robbing the gangs that were peddling drugs and weapons here in the lower hive. It's funny, here in the lower hive, crime was just as rampant as the underhive, but it was more sophisticated. You would be mugged and beaten up here in the lower hive, but in the underhive, you would be jumped, killed, and then eaten, as the money and resources people carried typically weren't enough for a day's worth of food. Elesmere was a big girl and had literally lived more than 3 times my lifetime, so she could find ways to accumulate credits without drawing too much attention. Especially as she could use her psychic abilities to get people to hand over their money and wipe their memories of such an incident, though it would be tiring doing such a thing and not leave obvious signs. I am going to start my experiments. Can you help me do a couple things before you go? I said as I pulled a bunch of cinder blocks on a trolley, as I began to make something akin to a large igloo, and then had Elesmere make some wraith bone to act as plaster for the interior of the igloo to isolate any unabsorbed warp energies. Well, wish me luck. I am going to bake myself in the igloo, I said, brushing my hands clear of some of the dust. Wouldn't this instead be a kiln then? Elesmere asked dryly, and I threw her a dirty look as I waved her off. As I went into the kiln/igloo, it was large enough for me to basically stand up, but my hands would touch the walls as I fully extended them out from my sides. So, in the worst case, so long as the containment doesn't breach, allowing the hole into the warp to break open further, nothing I summoned would be larger than the free space in the little kiln/igloo. Okay, I admit calling this homemade spiritual energy concentrator a kiln made much more sense, despite it looking more like an igloo, as it would be concentrating energies within like a kiln would bake stuff within, rather than an igloo that kept the cold out basically. I will be staying here to watch. In case you open an actual warp storm that engulfs the planet, I wouldn't be able to escape, so being here in order to tell you I told you so would be far more satisfying. As I slammed closed the wraithbone door to the kiln, I couldn't help but mutter about petty women before I sat down in the middle of the array I had already placed upon the ground that would act to congregate the surrounding energies, and, in this case, the ever-present warp energies in the galaxy. With a flicker, the array spluttered to life from my chi, injecting a spark of life into it before its directives took over, and it latched onto the warp and began sucking energy and small particulates through the tiny hole it opened into the warp. I opened my mouth and began taking deep breaths, operating my heavenly demon swallowing art as I swallowed and used my chi to dissolve the warp energies and the tiny bits of demonic essence that arrived through the tiny hole that began filling the kiln with a powerful concentration of warp energies. Like 10 minutes later of greedily absorbing bountiful energies that matched a couple weeks of solid meditation of non-stop cultivation, I began feeling the warp as if it were prodding at the walls of the array that opened the hole into the warp. Humph, come on, little minnow, jump into a catfish's mouth. I thought before a sudden tug wrenched at the walls of the array in order to widen it, and I gleefully allowed it as I felt the tugging sensation on the other end of the warp was weak despite its abrupt pulling at it. A tiny golf ball-sized mewling chaos spawn that looked like some kind of red-toned shoggoth rolled out of the now visible warp hole, and with another deep breath from me, the chaos spawn flew up and dissolved into my mouth and actually tasted a bit like watermelon, honestly. Even better than its delicious taste was the fact that I felt my cultivation leap forward as though I had just swallowed a whole month's worth of cultivation with only energy cubes to augment my meditations. But as though emboldened by the chaos spawn, making it through to the material world, I felt a great number of almost touches and caresses against my array that operated the tier into the warp. Let's not get carried away, I muttered as I realized I could only absorb one demon at a time, and to put bluntly, if it wasn't for my array acting as a stopgap, the little kiln I had would be flooded with them already, and I refused to be at the bottom of demon dog pile as it were. I then closed the array, much to the scrambling presence's dismay on the other side that attempted to force their way through the small tear in reality, but the crack closed under my array-assisted power without issue. Alright, well, might as well make good on calling this thing a kiln, I said as I realized I was literally coated in chaos energies along with the inside of the kiln, so I flared my internal star into existence until the cream-toned wraithbone began changing colors and I could no longer sense any additional warp energy.